the originality of Benedict is really his capacity to take something unwieldy and harsh, and perhaps even from the perspective of his own time, rather condescending and stratified, and somehow put it together into a format that's both usable, easily comprehensible, and suddenly breathes charity, a flexibility, compassion. The Rule of the Master, although very typical of quite a number of monastic approaches of his own day, represents a kind of very almost monolithic approach to monasticism, in which there is a rigid stratification of society. And I think the Rule of Benedict and the Master have to be understood in light of at least minimal awareness of the fact that society in Benedict's day had collapsed. People were living in a completely collapsed and slowly recovering society, one which had had the capital of empire, the capital of a sense of self-importance completely shifted away from it. It was no longer even in Italy. It had been shifted off to what is now Turkey, the city of Constantinople. And the people left behind in Italy, the people left behind in Rome, had this tremendous sense of abandonment, which was powerfully experienced by them in the deteriorating glory of a former empire. Buildings were collapsing. Aqueducts no longer functioned. Benedict lived in a society in a kind of a state of collapse and despair, which is almost unthinkable today, except in the minds of authors of science fiction films and books, or maybe people who visit some countries in the third world that are now recovering from colonialism, but are attempting to recover something of a completely collapsed infrastructure. That's the world that Benedict and the Master were writing in. And so it's really understandable that in a world which is desperately looking around for anything that will provide structure and stability, that someone like the Master would emphasize the need for rigidity, for clarity, for a kind of a hierarchy understood in a negative sense. That doesn't always have to be a negative word, but from his perspective, or given the spin that he puts on it, we would regard it as a fairly negative thing, because for him, the abbot is the master, which in Latin means the teacher, but not just the teacher in terms of the one who imparts wisdom, but the one who is always to be listened to and before whom only silence is appropriate. So in the Master's rule, you have a strong sense that the abbot is someone who has charge, who commands, who teaches, and to whom the only obvious and important response is obedience and respect. And the goal of each monk, in some sense, is to imitate the abbot, is to try to be like him. And Benedict does a beautiful job of shifting that metaphor without completely destroying it. But in the Master's rule, you want to be like the abbot so you can one day step into his power and his authority. You want to emulate and imitate the abbot's virtues so that he'll like you, and so that you someday can be someone in charge of the same kinds of things. In other words, you emulate the man of power so you can step into power. And Benedict, while insisting that yes, indeed, the abbot should be someone who is worthy of emulation, someone whose lifestyle should be imitated, has a radically different understanding of how that works and what it means. It's no longer that you imitate the abbot so that you can become the abbot. It's the abbot is the one who is living out the kind of life you want to live. You elect him for that reason. You expect him to be able to do that. And Benedict has some very powerful and even harsh sections, not for ordinary monks, but for the abbot, reminding him that he is to live out the virtues that he expects of his monks. And he shouldn't command anything that he isn't willing to do himself. He shouldn't expect anyone to show a certain quality of perfection that he hasn't already manifested to the ones whom he's expecting to show it. And that's a very different approach from what you find in the Master. It's not, I'll try to get you to like me and I'll imitate you so that I can step into your power, but you stand for me as a sign of what Christ is inviting me to become, not only in this world, but in the next, and I want to learn how you did it. I want to listen to you and learn from you because I want to incorporate into my own process of moral change and contemplative growth the insights you were able to come to. That's Benedict's vision of the abbot, and to be able to shift something much darker and without completely destroying it, in a sense allowing much of the language and many of the concepts to still be retained, but to be filled with a whole new kind of life and freshness is part of what Benedict's genius really consists in. And the role of the abbot and the notion of the abbot as one who should be imitated is only one of many examples. One could talk about length. One could talk about the master's tendency to say a thing over and over again. His tendency to micromanage matters. I mean, if you look at what the rule of the master consists in, it's full of all these crazy forms of micromanagement. Basically, he even tells the people who are serving at table how they're to collect the crumbs and what they're supposed to do with it. He has all these kinds of specific and idiotic, really, rules for what's supposed to be done in the kitchen and strange symbols that are supposed to be used at the refectory, at the place of meals. Benedict is much less willing to try to legislate that. He says these are the kinds of things you have to work out in your own local community. He leaves things much more general. He removes about 2/3 of the bulk, and with it he takes away a lot of not just the rigidity, but the attempts to tell people how to run their own departments, which is something that those departments need to be able to elaborate on their own on the basis of what the community needs. And again, one could go through quite a number of examples from the rule on just exactly that.